"Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 minutes before his entire world collapsed. Cedar Creek Medical sprawls across 8 city blocks in Houston, all glass and steel and the sharp smell of antiseptic that never quite masks the undertone of fear. Rachel Torres arrives at 6:19 a.m. on a Tuesday, badge clipped to her scrub pocket, her name printed in letters so small they're almost invisible. She is a temp. A contract nurse. Someone whose name the full-time staff doesn't quite retain. This is intentional. She moves through the surgical wing like water finding its level, not drawing attention, not demanding space, simply occupying it with the kind of ease that comes from having already survived worse. Her scrubs are pressed sharper than anyone else's. Her hands are steady as surgical steel. Along her right forearm runs a scar roughly 4 inches long, the kind that comes from field medicine in places where antibiotics are rationed and infection is a death sentence. She touches it sometimes during her shift, pressing 2 fingers against the white tissue as if confirming something only she understands. The surgical residents barely notice her except for the inexplicable way she anticipates instrument needs before surgeons ask for them. A surgeon's hand rises. The instrument is already there, placed with the precision of someone who has done this 10,000 times in conditions that made Cedar Creek look like a resort. They mark it down to experience. They don't ask questions. Nobody asks the temp questions. Dr. Whitfield notices everything else, the way she moves through his domain, the quiet competence that makes no noise but changes outcomes. The chief of surgery built his reputation on one principle: absolute control. Every person in his surgical wing has a rank, a hierarchy, a place in the architecture of his authority. Rachel Torres occupies none of these places. She is outside the system. She is uncontrollable. This is intolerable to him. She is scrubbing in for her second case of the morning, a routine gallbladder removal, 90 minutes, textbook surgery, when Whitfield enters the observation deck above the surgical floor. He watches her for 8 minutes. Her hand movements. The way she reads the resident surgeon's intentions from body language alone. The way she prevents a complication before it happens by repositioning a retractor at exactly the right angle. Her presence makes the air pressure change in ways he doesn't understand and hates immediately. When she emerges from the surgical suite at 9:35 a.m., already changed back into scrubs for the next case, he intercepts her in the corridor. The hallway is empty except for an orderly pushing a medication cart 30 feet away. Whitfield positions himself between Rachel and the elevators, his body language carrying the weight of someone accustomed to obedience. He looks her up and down with the precision of a man evaluating livestock. "You're the temp, right?" "Rachel." His voice carries the casual cruelty of someone who has never encountered consequences. His tie is Hermes. His watch is probably more expensive than her car. His smile does not reach his eyes. It never will. Rachel nods once. A single motion. No flourish. No apology for existing. "Let's see how long you last here," Whitfield says, his voice dropping into something that sounds almost conversational. "I'm betting you don't make it past Friday." "That's 48 hours. 2 days. He turns to face the resident who has just appeared from around the corner, a young surgeon named Mitchell, fresh enough that he still looks impressed by his own white coat. "You hearing this, Mitchell?" "Our temp nurse here, Rachel, she quits by Friday. I'll put $500 on it. Anyone want that action?" Mitchell laughs. It is the laugh of someone who doesn't yet understand the cost of dissent. "That's a bet, Dr. Whitfield." Whitfield walks away without waiting for Rachel's response. This is the point, her response doesn't matter. The message has been delivered. She is not expected to survive. She is expected to prove him right by disappearing. Rachel's jaw tightens imperceptibly. Not enough for Mitchell to notice. Not enough for the orderly with the medication cart to catch. Her breathing remains steady. Her eyes remain clear. Her hands, still holding the chart from the previous surgery, do not tremble. This is not composure born from peace. It is composure born from having learned in places where trembling meant death. It is composure that has held its shape through sandstorms and mortar fire and the weight of impossible choices made at 2 a.m. under enemy fire. She passes Whitfield in the hallway 3 hours later during the lunch rush. The cafeteria is at maximum density: surgical residents, nurses, attending physicians, medical students, orderlies. The kind of chaos where a single loud noise goes unnoticed. Rachel is carrying a tray, a coffee, a salad, a bottle of water. Small intake. Quiet fuel. The kind of eating that makes no demands. Whitfield emerges from the beverage station. Their paths intersect perfectly, too perfectly. He does not step aside. His arm comes up almost casually, a movement that could be mistaken for clumsiness, for an accident, for the kind of thing that happens in crowded spaces. His hand contacts her tray at the precise angle required to achieve maximum chaos. The tray rotates through the air with the mathematical certainty of something intentional. Coffee spills across her scrubs in a brown arc. The salad container tumbles. The water bottle clatters against the tile floor with a sound like a drop bell. Everything goes quiet for exactly 1 second, the length of time it takes for 30 people to realize this wasn't an accident. "Oh, Christ, I'm so sorry," Whitfield says, his voice dripping with false contrition. "Clumsy me." "You okay there, Rachel?" She does not respond. She looks down at the spreading coffee stain on her chest, brown spreading across blue like an ink bloom. Around her, residents are pretending to eat. A nurse 3 tables away looks up, then away, then down at her food again. Nobody intervenes. Nobody wants to become the target. The cafeteria smells like disinfectant and spilled coffee and the particular shame of public humiliation. Whitfield is already moving away, already back toward his table, already resuming his conversation with Mitchell and 2 other residents. He has made his point. He is untouchable. He is the chief of surgery at Cedar Creek Medical, and this hospital is his kingdom. The temp nurse is nobody. The temp nurse is already marked for elimination. Rachel stands motionless for 3 seconds. Her breathing has not accelerated. Her eyes are not shining. She does not cry. She does not retreat to a supply closet to compose herself. She simply reaches down and begins to gather the scattered items from the floor with steady, methodical precision. But that wasn't the worst part. An hour later, at 1:52 p.m., during a brief window between surgeries, Rachel is reviewing lab results in the charting station, a small desk tucked into the corner of the surgical wing where the resident staff clusters around computers. Whitfield approaches from behind. This time, there are witnesses. 3 residents at a nearby station. A surgical tech at the supply cabinet. A patient's family member being escorted to the waiting area. This is deliberate. This is calculated. This is the escalation that comes when the first move doesn't break the target. He holds a patient chart in his right hand. Specific patient, specific case, specific moment of opportunity. He drops it at her feet with enough force that the corner cracks against the tile. The sound carries. People look up. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Whitfield says, and his voice carries the particular venom of someone who believes he has already won. His smile is the smile of a man who has never encountered a consequence in his life. His eyes are the eyes of someone who has spent so long with power that he has forgotten what it looks like when someone doesn't flinch. Rachel looks down at the chart. She looks up at Whitfield. She looks around at the watching residents. For one moment, one single moment, her hand could shake. Her voice could crack. Her face could flush with the heat of humiliation. Instead, her jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in her neck become visible. Not from fear. From something else entirely. From the particular restraint that comes from someone who has been trained in 17 different ways to end a conflict and is choosing every second not to use any of them. Her hand comes down. Steady. Mechanical. The hand of someone whose muscles have memory that predates this hospital, this city, this civilian life. She retrieves the chart from the floor. Her movements are controlled. Her breathing is controlled. Her face is a mask of professional composure, the kind of mask that takes practice to maintain when humiliation is burning in your chest like a second heartbeat. "Anything else, doctor?" she says quietly. Her voice is smooth. It carries no edge. It carries no rage. It carries nothing at all, which is, perhaps, the most terrifying thing of all. Whitfield is disappointed that she hasn't broken. He was expecting tears or anger or some kind of visible crack in the facade. What he gets instead is perfect, terrible composure. What he gets is someone looking at him with eyes that have seen far worse things than his contempt. He leaves without answering, dismissing her with the casual wave of someone returning to something more important. Rachel stands there, holding the chart, as the surgical wing resumes its normal rhythm. The residents turn back to their computers. The surgical tech returns to restocking supplies. The patient's family member is guided away toward the waiting area. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead with their constant, mechanical drone. She has survived 48 minutes of his attention. She has survived the public bet, the cafeteria assault, the chart on the floor, the word sweetheart delivered with the precision of a blade. She has 2 more days until Friday. Until his bet is fulfilled or broken. She has no idea what is about to walk through those hospital doors. The break room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. Dr. Whitfield stood in the center of a cluster of surgical residents, his white coat crisp as a hospital corner, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of making other people smaller. Rachel stood at the periphery, near the supply requisition clipboard, her fingers moving across the page with mechanical precision. She wasn't looking at him. She didn't need to. "I'm making a public prediction," Whitfield announced, loud enough to ensure she heard every syllable. "Our little temp nurse here. She won't last. 5 days maximum before the pressure breaks her. Any takers on that bet?" Nervous laughter rippled through the residents like water disturbed by a stone. 2 of them exchanged uncomfortable glances, the kind that said they'd seen this performance before and knew how it ended. Rachel continued writing, her hand moving in perfectly steady strokes. Not a tremor. Not a hesitation. The pen didn't waver across the clipboard as if she were recording vitals, not insults. Whitfield waited for a reaction. Some sign of cracking. Some indication that his words had landed. Rachel turned the page. Kept writing. His smirk deepened. He left. That afternoon, the cafeteria during lunch rush was a collision of bodies and noise, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like a swarm of mechanical insects, trays clattering, voices echoing off tile floors. Rachel carried her tray past the physician's table where Whitfield sat with 4 department heads, their heads bent together in the kind of conspiratorial cluster that usually meant someone else's career was being discussed. She didn't slow down. Didn't make eye contact. Just passed like she was invisible. Whitfield's foot extended slightly. The tray tilted. Soup and salad cascaded across the white tile floor in a spectacular crash, the kind of sound that stops a room mid-breath. The cafeteria fell silent. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward her as if on a hinge. Whitfield looked up with mock concern, his face arranged in an expression of false sympathy. "Oh, sweetheart, you should be more careful. Tired from the demanding work." Rachel kneeled immediately. Her face was a mask. The kind of composure that comes from having already survived worse, from having performed field medicine in sandstorms while rounds whistled past, from having kept a wounded translator alive by pure force of will through 5 miles of hostile territory. Humiliation was information. Pain was data. Neither changed what her hands could do. She gathered the debris with methodical precision, placing each item on the tray as if performing a medical procedure. Her breathing stayed even. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. A janitor approached with a mop, but she was already finished, standing with a ruined tray and walking to the disposal area without a word. The cafeteria resumed its noise. She'd already been forgotten. The next morning during pre-op rounds, Whitfield entered the surgical prep area where Rachel was organizing instrument trays, her hands arranging forceps and clamps with the same care someone might arrange flowers. He pulled a patient chart from under his arm, threw it on the floor at her feet. Papers scattered like snow. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice like honey poured over broken glass. Two surgical residents watched from the doorway. They always did. He needed witnesses. Rachel's jaw clenched for half a second, the only visible crack in her composure, the smallest betrayal of the humiliation burning in her chest. Then she crouched and gathered every page with the same steady hands that could suture arteries blindfolded, hands that had held lives together in places where there were no sterile fields, only dust and desperation. She reassembled the chart in perfect order. Handed it to him without meeting his eyes. Whitfield leaned close, his breath reaching her like poison gas. "You don't belong here. You're just a temp playing dress-up." Rachel turned back to her instrument tray and continued working as if he'd never spoken. The words moved through her like bullets through water, they made ripples but they didn't stick. Though a flush crept up her neck, visible only to someone standing very close, the only sign that the knife had found a place to dig. That afternoon, the OR doors slid open for an emergency appendectomy, and Rachel scrubbed in alongside Dr. Chen, a senior attending who treated her with professional courtesy, the kind that made clear he didn't see her as a threat to his hierarchy. The surgical tech across the sterile field was Marcus Webb, a disabled veteran who walked with a pronounced limp, the kind that came from an IED detonating too close to a Humvee. Former Marine combat medic. Now civilian medical support. But medics don't stop being medics. They just change uniforms. The appendix was gangrenous, inflamed, a textbook emergency. Dr. Chen called for closure, and as Rachel assisted, he asked her to place a subcuticular suture on a particularly difficult angle, the kind of delicate work that separated competent nurses from the ones who'd been trained in actual war. Rachel's hands moved. The modified continuous stitch pattern was muscle memory, the kind that lives in tendons and bone, taught by sergeants in dusty compounds where infection meant amputation and amputation meant death. She minimized tissue trauma and accelerated healing with movements that were economical and precise, every thread placed with the logic of someone who'd learned field surgery not from textbooks but from keeping people alive when there were no textbooks and no time. Marcus froze mid-instrument pass. His eyes locked on her technique. His breathing changed, just slightly, the way a predator's breathing changes when it catches a scent it recognizes. Rachel felt the weight of his stare and glanced up for half a second across the sterile field. Their eyes met. Recognition flashed in his face like a light switching on. That specific suturing method was taught only to Special Forces medics deployed to Fallujah in 2007, a field surgery adaptation for combat conditions when traditional techniques failed, when you had seconds instead of minutes and your patient was bleeding out on a concrete floor. There was no other reason a civilian temp nurse would know that pattern. No other explanation. No other path that led to hands moving that way. Rachel's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. A silent plea contained in that brief looked, "Please don't say anything. Please let me keep burying this. Please let me stay invisible." Marcus gave the smallest nod. His expression carefully shifted to neutral. The kind of professional distance that military people learn to deploy like a weapon. He returned his attention to the instrument tray. But twice more during the procedure, he watched her hands with the careful attention of someone solving a puzzle, watching the evidence accumulate, watching the pattern form into a picture of a life lived in classified spaces. After the surgery, as Rachel stripped off her gloves in the scrub room, the latex peeling away like old skin, Marcus appeared in the doorway. His limp was pronounced after hours of standing, the pain was written in the set of his jaw, but he stood anyway. "That was good work in there," he said quietly, his tone loaded with unspoken meaning. The kind of weight that only carries between people who've operated in the same war. Real good. Field-grade good. Rachel's hands paused for a fraction of a second over the disposal bin. The recognition in his voice hit her like a physical thing. "Just what I was trained to do," she said softly, her voice carrying a burden of buried history, of 15 years spent erasing herself from existence, of the Navy burying an operation so deep that officially, Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had never existed at all. Marcus nodded slowly, watching her with the kind of understanding that only comes from shared combat. I bet you were trained real well. Somebody should remember that. He limped away, leaving Rachel staring at her reflection in the scrub room mirror, pale, composed, giving nothing away. But inside her chest, something shifted. Fear and something like hope warred in that reflection, fighting for dominance, both of them terrified of what came next. For the first time since she'd arrived at Cedar Creek Medical, someone knew. Not everything, but enough. Enough to change everything if he decided to speak. And that was the most dangerous part of all. The overhead speaker crackled at 2:48 p.m. Code Blue, Recovery Room 4. Code Blue, Recovery Room 4. The announcement hung in the fluorescent air like a held breath, and Rachel's hands stopped moving mid-reach for a surgical instrument tray. Her body responded before her mind caught up. The muscle memory was older than her name, carved into her nervous system by 17 years of operating under pressure, in places where the next sound might be incoming fire. She set down the betadine bottle and moved toward the recovery wing, then caught herself. Temp nurse. Not authorized. Not her patient. Not her responsibility. She turned back to the supply closet, but the next voice she heard in the hallway made her free solid. Where's Dr. Whitfield? The on-call is stuck on IE-10, massive accident, is looking at 30 minutes minimum, maybe 45. A resident's voice. Panicked. Young. The kind of panic that meant someone was about to die while competent people stood around waiting for permission to act. Rachel moved. Not walking. Moving. The kind of movement that covered distance without wasted motion, the way soldiers cross open ground under observation. Recovery Room 4 was 3 corridors east and 1 flight of stairs up. She took the stairs 4 at a time, her scrub-covered legs carrying her up with the efficiency of someone who'd run through Fallujah with 40 pounds of gear in 117-degree heat. The door to Recovery Room 4 was open, and what she saw inside made her jaw tighten, the only crack in her composure, because what she was seeing violated every protocol she'd spent 2 days obeying. A man lay on the recovery bed, maybe 52, his chest heaving against the oxygen mask. His monitor showed ventricular fibrillation. VFib. The most lethal rhythm the human heart could throw at you. 2 residents stood frozen on either side of the bed like statues in a museum of incompetence. Defibrillator pads were attached. The monitor showed they'd already shocked him twice. The third shock was coming, but Rachel could see what they couldn't: the distended neck veins, the way his abdomen was rigid and swelling, the subtle wrongness of how the heart was responding to electricity that should have worked. Cardiac tamponade, she said. Not a question. A diagnosis. A command hidden inside 3 words. Both residents looked at her like she'd materialized from another dimension. His chest is filling with fluid, we need to, the younger one stammered, gesturing at the monitor where the line was going flat. Asystole. No electrical activity. Game over if nothing happened in the next 30 seconds. Rachel was already moving to the instrument tray, already glancing at what was available. Not enough. Wrong tray. She turned to the nearest nurse, a woman in her 50s with the rigid posture of someone who'd been working here long enough to know the rules. I need a thoracotomy tray. Now. You're not authorized to. Now, Rachel said. Not loud. Not angry. Cold. The word came out with the weight of someone who'd given orders under circumstances where the penalty for hesitation was body bags, and the nurse moved like she'd heard something in that voice that bypassed her objections and spoke directly to her survival instinct. Rachel was already gloving, her fingers sliding into latex with precision, the snap of the glove sealing around her wrist sounding like a weapon being chambered. 40 seconds now. 45. She took the betadine bottle from the tray and began painting the patient's chest in broad, efficient strokes, the antiseptic smell rising up sharp and chemical. The residents watched, and Rachel could feel their confusion like heat. This temp nurse. This woman who'd been getting humiliated in the cafeteria 2 days ago. This person who was supposed to be restocking supply rooms. Rachel didn't think about any of that. She picked up the scalpel. The blade was German steel, surgical grade, the kind of tool that needed precision and speed in equal measure. She made the incision, skin, subcutaneous tissue, muscle, separating the pectoralis major, feeling the resistance of each layer, moving through anatomy like she was reading a map written in her own flesh. The ribs came next, and she used the rib retractor to spread them open, the mechanical click of the ratchet sounding like the safety on a rifle being moved to fire position. The pericardium was visible now, the sac that surrounded the heart, and Rachel could see the problem immediately. It was bulging with blood, the heart compressed inside like a fist squeezing a bird. She opened the sac with a single cut, and blood poured out. 300 milliliters. Maybe more. The heart was freed, and Rachel's hands moved to the patient's heart itself, her fingers finding the position for direct cardiac massage through the open chest, the exact pressure, the exact rhythm, the exact tempo that she'd learned in a medical facility in Fallujah where they didn't have time for conventional medicine. Compression. Release. Compression. Release. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this in sandstorms, with RPG shrapnel still falling, with the radio crackling that air support was 3 minutes out, with lives depending on her keeping a rhythm that her body remembered even when her mind tried to bury it. 30 compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The monitor showed nothing at first. The line stayed flat. The room was absolutely silent except for the ventilator's mechanical breathing and the wet sound of blood and the steady compression of a heart responding to her hands instead of its own electrical system. 40 seconds. 50. The heart trembled under her fingers. Not a real contraction. Just a spasm. Electrical noise. But it was something. Rachel adjusted her pressure, her angle, her rhythm, pulling from memory banks that she'd spent 2 years trying to seal shut. The resident closest to her was staring at her hands like he was watching something impossible unfold. The monitor beeped. Once. The line jumped. Then again. The rhythm caught, not perfect, but functional. Sinus. Beautiful, normal, alive sinus rhythm. The heart was beating on its own again, and Rachel felt the surge of response under her palms, the pressure rising on the monitor, the oxygen saturation climbing. 62, 71. 84 was stable. She continued the compressions for another minute, making sure the rhythm held, making sure the heart remembered how to do its job without her hands guiding it. When she was certain, when she could feel the strength in the pulse, when the monitor showed a steady line instead of chaos, she slowly withdrew her hands and began closing. Sutures. Careful. Precise. Each knot holding, the kind of stitching that didn't tear when you were running through hostile territory carrying a wounded translator. The pericardium first. Then the ribs. Then the muscle, the subcutaneous, the skin. Her hands were moving on memory, the routine so ingrained that she could do it with her eyes closed, and she nearly was, almost lost in the muscle memory, when she heard the younger resident take a breath like he was surfacing from underwater. That's not, how did you? He couldn't finish. Rachel closed the final suture and stepped back. The room came back into focus. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The monitor beeped its steady confirmation that the patient was alive because Rachel Torres, temp nurse at Cedar Creek Medical, whose job was to restock supply rooms and absorb humiliation with a neutral expression, had just performed a procedure that belonged in a trauma bay at a forward operating base, not in the recovery room of a civilian hospital in Houston. She peeled off the gloves. The latex made a snapping sound, precise and final. Someone paged Dr. Whitfield, she said, her professional mask sliding back into place like a visor coming down. Her voice was controlled. Measured. Almost bored. Tell him his patient is stable. One of the residents nodded mutely. Rachel turned to leave, and that's when she felt it, the trembling in her hands. Not fear. Not weakness. Restraint. The physical manifestation of 17 years of pushing something dangerous down into a locked room, and that door had just cracked open. She kept her hands at her sides as she walked out, kept them still, kept the mask in place even as her body remembered Fallujah, remembered the medevac helicopters, remembered the weight of a Marine's body across her shoulders as she ran toward safety through streets where safety didn't exist anymore. She was back in the supply room restocking betadine bottles when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. 3 words, "We know now." The veteran. The surgical tech from the appendectomy. The one who'd recognized her hands. Rachel didn't respond. She couldn't. Because the moment she'd cracked that patient's chest and performed direct cardiac massage in a civilian hospital, she'd exposed the one thing she'd spent 8 years hiding. She'd crossed a line that had no going back. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Whitfield was about to find out exactly what he'd tried to humiliate out of Cedar Creek Medical, and he was going to be very, very sorry he ever asked Rachel Torres to pick up a chart. Dr. Whitfield arrived 20 minutes after the code blue, his face the color of raw liver. His shoes clicked against the tile in a rhythm like a countdown timer. He didn't look at the patient, stable now, color returning to his lips, chest rising with the ventilator's mechanical wheeze. He looked at Rachel. Pure venom in his eyes, the kind of look that could strip paint. "You performed a thoracotomy." His voice came out low, controlled, which was somehow worse than shouting. "You." A temp nurse. With zero surgical authority. Rachel stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her face expressionless as granite. The patient was dying. The on-call surgeon was stuck in traffic on I-10. "I made the clinical assessment that." "You made nothing," Whitfield cut her off, stepping closer. His breath smelled like coffee and something bitter underneath. "Nothing. You exceeded your scope. Violated hospital protocol. What you did could be prosecuted as assault." He turned to the residents, his voice dropping to something almost reasonable. "Document everything. Every detail. I want a complete incident report on my desk before end of shift." The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a 4th-year named Chen, looked like she wanted to speak, then swallowed it. They knew what they'd seen. A patient with cardiac tamponade, bleeding out, a rhythm that was flatline. And hands that moved like they'd done this before, maybe in places that didn't exist on any official map. Rachel watched Whitfield's jaw work. He was calculating, pivoting, shifting from humiliation into something far more dangerous. This was no longer about breaking her composure. This was about erasing her. Within an hour, Whitfield was in his office with his door closed and his phone pressed to his ear. Rachel could track the destruction in real time because hospital walls were thin and gossip traveled like electricity. First call, the hospital board chairman, a man named Sterling who'd attended medical school with Whitfield's brother. Whitfield's voice was controlled, measured, the voice of a man reporting a tragedy. She exceeded scope of practice. Committed what could be considered assault on a patient. Extraordinary breach of protocol. We need to discuss liability exposure. Second call, the temp agency at 2:48 p.m. Rachel watched from the break room as a supervisor pulled her file, frowning. Whitfield had called with fabricated complaints, tardiness, medication errors that never happened, patient complaints from patients she'd never treated. Lies stacked like bricks. "We'll have to remove her from the Cedar Creek rotation immediately," the supervisor said when the call disconnected. Rachel heard it from 2 doors down. Gossip traveled fast, especially when it was about termination. Third call, the hospital's risk management director and an outside investigator. Whitfield just suggested, that Rachel's nursing license might be fraudulent, that her credentials should be reviewed for irregularities. His tone was one of concern, a fellow physician simply trying to protect the institution. By 3:15 p.m., the investigator was already in the hospital, clipboard in hand, asking questions. Rachel sat in the break room, still wearing her scrubs, the front of them stained with the blood of a man she'd just saved. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. But her eyes were following the clock on the wall like it was counting down to an execution. The summons came at 3:42 p.m. Human Resources. 4th floor. Now. The director's name was Patterson, a woman in her 50s who wouldn't meet Rachel's eyes. Her office smelled like hand sanitizer and the particular shame of people delivering bad news. The words came out practiced, like she'd delivered them before. Your assignment at Cedar Creek Medical is terminated effective immediately. You will surrender your hospital badge. Security will escort you from the premises. Rachel's face showed nothing. A mask of professional calm. But her hands gripped the edge of the desk hard enough that her knuckles went white. The patient I treated today, he was in acute cardiac tamponade. His output was dropping. The on-call surgeon was 13 minutes away. I made the clinical decision that is not your concern anymore, Patterson interrupted, sliding a termination letter across the desk. Please surrender your badge. 2 security guards appeared in the doorway like they'd been summoned by her voice. Standard protocol. One of them had worked security for 3 years, had always been professional, had once helped Rachel steady a confused elderly patient in the hallway. He wouldn't look at her now. They walked her through the surgical wing. Through hallways she'd moved through for months, past nurses she'd worked beside, past patients she'd comforted. Her badge was confiscated at the main desk with ceremony, as if the act of taking it was official. Final. Some staff members looked away. One nurse, Jessica, from the night shift, made eye contact for a fraction of a second, something like apology in her eyes, before turning back to her charts. Dr. Whitfield watched from the observation deck above Trauma Bay 1, his arms crossed, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd done it. He'd broken her with nothing but phone calls and institutional power. He'd proven that no matter what she could do, no matter how many lives she could save, she was still just a temp. Still disposable. Still nothing. Rachel maintained absolute composure until she was in her car, a 2011 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles, parked in the employee lot where she'd been parking for 6 months. She sat motionless behind the wheel for 15 minutes, staring at nothing. Her hands were shaking now, finally. The adrenaline wearing off like a drug, leaving behind only the crash. At home that afternoon, she was still wearing her scrubs at 3 p.m. Still in them, the blood dried brown now, the cotton stiff and foreign on her skin. She sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. Her 8-year-old daughter, Emma, came home from school at 3:28 p.m. Her backpack slipped off her shoulder as she stopped in the kitchen doorway. She had Rachel's eyes, dark, sharp, missing nothing. "Mommy? Why are you home so early?" Her voice was small. Confused. Frightened. Rachel tried to wipe her eyes but the tears kept coming, silent and relentless. She couldn't explain. Couldn't tell her daughter that she'd been running for 15 years. That Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Maria Torres had died on paper after a Black Ops mission in Fallujah went sideways in March 2008, when an operation that should never have happened went wrong in ways the Pentagon would never discuss. That the Navy had buried the operation and classified her service records, told her she was dead on paper, forbidden from ever resurfacing, from ever claiming the uniform or the medals or the missions, all to protect secrets she'd never be allowed to speak aloud. She couldn't explain that she'd been a ghost. That every job, every relationship, every moment of her existence had been lived under the weight of erasure. That today, for just a few minutes, she'd been real again, she'd saved a man's life and her hands had remembered exactly what to do because her hands had done it before. And it had cost her everything. "Did you get fired?" Emma asked, the word so direct, so innocent, so perfectly accurate that Rachel flinched. "Something like that, baby." Rachel's voice came out broken. "Come here." Emma crossed the kitchen and climbed into her mother's lap with the absolute trust of a child who didn't understand how the world worked, who didn't know that sometimes the good people lost. Rachel held her daughter and cried harder than she'd cried in 15 years, the composure she'd maintained through humiliation and contempt and calculated cruelty finally shattering in the privacy of their kitchen, with nothing but the afternoon light coming through the window as witness. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that 2 days later, her phone would ring with a call that would change everything. A mass casualty event would bring her back into the hospital, back into the light, and the secret she'd spent 15 years burying would finally come into the open, whether the Pentagon wanted them to or not. 2 days. That's how long Rachel Torres waited at her kitchen table before the phone rang. The number was unknown, but the caller ID said Cedar Creek Medical. She stared at it for 2 rings before answering, her voice steady despite the way her hand had started to shake. Ms. Torres. A voice she didn't recognize, breathless, urgent. This is hospital operations. We have a mass casualty event, 15 minutes out. 2-vehicle collision on the Beltway, multiple critical patients. We're calling back every available surgical staff member. Can you come in? Rachel's jaw tightened. The same hospital that had escorted her out by security. The same place where Dr. Whitfield had made sure every administrator and board member knew she was done. Ms. Torres? Are you there? I'll be there in 20 minutes, Rachel said. She hung up before they could hear the breath she released. The drive was muscle memory, every turn, every light, the exact route she'd memorized in 16 months of temp shifts. Rain hammered the windshield like applause as she parked in the staff lot, moving through the emergency entrance without hesitation. The chaos was exactly what they described. Paramedics shouting, gurneys colliding, nurses running with 4 bags and trauma shears, the kind of controlled panic that meant lives hung in the balance by seconds. Rachel! A voice cut through the noise. Marcus Webb, the disabled veteran tech who'd recognized her technique during the appendectomy, was waving her toward Trauma Bay 3. We need you. Now. She didn't ask questions. She moved toward the trauma suite, her hands already reaching for gloves, her mind already assessing the scene. The patient on the gurney was conscious, pale, already prepped with 2 large-bore 4s. His face was bandaged on the left side, fresh sutures still weeping clear fluid. The moment she locked eyes with him, the moment she saw the scar tissue along his jawline, her entire body went perfectly still. She knew that scar. She'd seen it through rifle sights in Fallujah, 18 years ago. Before the Pentagon had erased her. Before Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had died on paper and been reborn as a temp nurse. His eyes widened. Recognition flooded across his face, the kind of recognition that meant he'd been thinking about her for 2 decades, wondering if she was still alive. Reaper 6, he whispered in accented English. His voice cracked. You're real. The room went dead silent. The trauma team froze mid-motion. Rachel's face remained completely unreadable, a mask of professional composure even as something ancient and long buried was clawing its way to the surface of her chest. That's Master Chief Petty Officer Torres, Marcus Webb said. His voice rang out like a command. You stand when she enters a room. Every medical professional within earshot straightened. Every one of them stopped moving. The disabled Marine's presence, the authority in those 7 words, the way he said her rank like it was scripture, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The air pressure changed. Before anyone could speak, the trauma bay doors burst open. A tall man in a navy dress uniform with admiral's insignia strode through, flanked by 2 enlisted personnel carrying a sealed folder bearing classified protocol stamps. The folder was 3 inches thick. Admiral James Keller, Chief of Naval Special Operations Command. The man who'd personally signed the order that buried Rachel's service record in 2006. His eyes found hers across the trauma bay. Recognition passed between them, the kind that only happens between people who've held the same secrets. Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, Admiral Keller said. His voice was quiet but it carried through the entire surgical wing. I'm here to restore your service record in front of this hospital's leadership, your colleagues, and every person in this room who needs to understand who you are. He opened the folder. Bronze Star for Valor during Operation Phantom Fury, Fallujah, 2004, the Admiral read. Awarded for extracting a wounded civilian translator under sustained small arms fire, carrying him 5 miles through hostile territory to a forward operating base while maintaining suppressive fire coverage. He paused. Reactions rippled through the room. Bronze Star, Second Action, 2005. For leading a direct action raid against 2 target compounds in the Jolan district, resulting in the capture of a high-value target and the recovery of classified materials. Another pause. Purple Heart. 2004, shrapnel wound sustained during an ambush near the Euphrates. He was reading methodically now, each medal getting its own sentence, its own beat, each one heavier than the last. Purple Heart, Second Award, 2005. Sustained gunshot wound to the left shoulder during a convoy ambush. His eyes met Rachel's. And Master Chief, there's one more. He pulled a separate document from the folder with ceremony. Navy Cross. Awarded for extraordinary heroism in direct combat against enemy forces, resulting in the rescue of 3 Allied personnel under conditions that would have been considered suicidal by standard engagement protocols. He looked directly at Dr. Whitfield, who'd been backing slowly toward the door, his face the color of surgical gauze. Your chief of surgery attempted to terminate Master Chief Torres' employment by forging her personnel records and submitting false performance complaints to her temp agency and this hospital's board. That's when the FBI agents walked in. Special Agent Flores and his partner, both in dark suits, both with badges that caught the trauma bay lights like mirrors. Flores produced a tablet and stepped directly in front of Dr. Whitfield, whose hands had begun to tremble. Dr. Harrison Whitfield, we've been monitoring your activities for 6 weeks as part of a federal investigation into credential fraud and document falsification at Cedar Creek Medical. Flores's voice was clinical, precise. When you submitted justification for Ms. Torres's termination, you fabricated patient complaints. You filed false performance reviews with her employment agency. You contacted an outside investigator and attempted to add forged addendums to her personnel file, federal documents. Whitfield's mouth opened and closed like a fish in shallow water. I was protecting. You were protecting your ego, Flores interrupted. Falsifying employment records is a federal felony, Doctor. Minimum 5 years. We've also identified for other incidents in the past 2 years where you submitted false documentation to remove staff who questioned your authority. The hospital's board chairman stepped forward, rage making his features sharp. Dr. Whitfield, you're suspended immediately pending termination proceedings. Security, escort him out. The same security guards who'd escorted Rachel out with her hospital badge confiscated, her shame public, her entire life dismantled in 12 minutes, those same guards now flanked Whitfield. His hands were trembling as the FBI cuffed him. His voice had become thin, desperate. I've been here 12 years, I built this department. Marcus Webb stepped forward and spoke quietly, the way combat veterans do when they're delivering a truth that's going to sting. Power you have to protect isn't power, sir. It's fear. Whitfield was led out in handcuffs, FBI taking custody, and in the 30 seconds before the trauma bay doors closed behind him, he made eye contact with Rachel one final time. There was no arrogance left in his face. No contempt. Only the hollow recognition of a man watching his entire world collapse into rubble. Rachel watched him go without expression, then turned back to her patient, the insurgent commander she'd captured 18 years ago, and quietly adjusted his full line with hands that were steady as surgical lasers. The monsoon of emotion could wait. For now, there was work to do. 6 months later, Rachel Torres walked through the surgical wing of Cedar Creek Medical wearing a white coat embroidered with a title that was finally hers, Director of Surgical Residency Program. The Navy had worked with hospital leadership to officially acknowledge her service record and authorize her to speak publicly about her career. The residents she supervised now treated her with respect that bordered on reverence, the kind of respect that comes from understanding you're being taught by someone who'd held actual lives in her hands, not in sterile simulation rooms but in combat zones, in sandstorms, under enemy fire. Her new office overlooked the surgical wing. On the shelf beside her medical text sat a single memento, a pair of worn combat boots from Fallujah. They were cleaned but still bearing the scars of 18,000 miles, 2 tours worth of distance walked through hostile territory, through war zones, through the chapters of her life that the Pentagon had tried to bury. David Brennan, the man she'd performed emergency thoracotomy on, visited the hospital monthly. He brought his brother-in-law, Khalid al-Rashid, the former insurgent commander she'd captured and now helped train as a medical volunteer. Khalid had recovered fully and was working with refugee resettlement organizations, advocating for Iraqi translators seeking asylum, the same translators Rachel had fought beside, had carried, had loved in the way soldiers do. Marcus Webb had been promoted to head of hospital security and collaborated with Rachel on veteran hiring initiatives. He understood better than anyone what it meant to find a second career after the Pentagon tried to erase you. And Dr. Whitfield? After his plea deal in exchange for testimony about the broader document fraud network operating at Cedar Creek, his medical license was permanently revoked. He now taught basic CPR certification courses at a Houston community college for minimum wage. Every class he taught, he was teaching because he'd failed to understand a fundamental truth. During a residency orientation session, a nervous first-year resident raised her hand. Director Torres, how do you handle difficult attendings who abuse their authority? Rachel was quiet for a moment. She reached for the combat boots on her shelf, turned them over in her hands, let the weight of them settle into her palms. I learned something in Fallujah that applies to medicine, she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. The moment you forget that, you've lost everything that matters. The residents leaned forward, all of them understanding they were being taught by someone who'd paid the cost of that knowledge in blood, in secrecy, in 18 years of being a ghost in her own country. Outside her window, a medevac helicopter lifted off from the hospital roof, its rotors beating the air in that rhythm Rachel knew better than her own heartbeat, the sound that meant someone was getting a second chance, the sound of rescue, the sound of coming home. She watched it disappear into the Houston afternoon, her hand resting on the boots that had carried her from Fallujah to this moment, from erasure back into the light. The extraordinary thing about quiet strength is that it never needs to announce itself. It just waits, steady and unshakable, until the world finally catches up. If you love a good underdog story, hit that like button now. Subscribe so you never miss one. And comment below, have you ever been the underdog? Let's see how this plays out.